Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a lecture on the death of the Neoliberal Order. And I wanted to do this lecture as kind of a follow-on to the populism lecture because one of the origins of populism in our contemporary world has been the challenge to, or injury to, or questioning of the neoliberal order, which was one of the dominant worldviews that shaped outlooks globally, regionally, in all kinds of ways. Up to, let's say the last 50 years, say from the 70s till today, something like that. I mean, you can push it back a little more, it's not dead yet, so I say the death of the neoliberal order, but, it's not quite dead yet, maybe it'll go on for a while. But I think this is a really interesting way, not just to explore the historical events surrounding this, but also to raise the question of values. Because values, I think, one way to understand them is those things that we believe without thinking about them. So we just sort of accept because they fit with our values. And so when they're exposed or when they're challenged or when something happens that leads us to question our values, it's very difficult and very painful. And it creates blind spots in our thinking and our reasoning and our understanding of the world because our beliefs, our fundamental values that inform our beliefs and our interpretation of the world go wonky when they're challenged with new information that just does not fit in. And this is certainly something that happened over the last 15 years or so. So neoliberal order, what is it? Where does it come from? And one can think of this as sort of a political economic consensus that was formed, when was it formed? It certainly came into the fore and really became one of the dominant modes of thinking in the 80s. So it's growing up in the 70s, and it really comes to the fore in the 80s until, roughly 2007, 2008. It was simply put the dominant worldview of the Atlantic economies, Europe, the United States, emerging economies, Latin America, Asian economies were working slightly differently, but boy, they were buying in a big way as well. And so the global political financial system was really built on this concept or this associated tree of concepts. And one thing to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this, but there are internal contradictions in all value systems. And so when we talk about the mistakes and errors and blind spots that are created with the neoliberal order, this is true of every order. There is no perfect set of values that flawlessly comprehends the universe and it delivers everything with perfection and reason, right? This is sort of a dream. Maybe that'll happen someday. I seriously doubt it. But so the criticism of the neoliberal order is not just on the sense that it's incoherent, because it is, but almost every value system has a certain base level of incoherence. So keep that in mind as we look at the different features of it. So this grows up as a sort of governing political, economic value system with the growth of industry and sort of international global finance capital. And it's built on a couple of very clear, simple to articulate foundations. One is free markets distribute resources better than governments. And so get the governments out of the way, let free markets distribute resources, and things will work better. They'll work, quote unquote, more efficiently. We'll talk about efficiency because that's always one of your tricky words out there. Deregulation, ipso facto. If you deregulate things, particularly industry and business and banking, then it runs better, government is out of the way, and so that's better for everybody. Free globalization. This is the whole rise of globalization. Everybody's heard about that, which was the idea that along with free markets and deregulation is the free movement of goods and capital. Now it's important to note this is goods, like material good, trades good, services like insurance, these sorts of things, and capital, which the cash can flow around the world freely or relatively freely. As part of this is a big belief in individual responsibility, so individuals make their own fate. There's a kind of, neoliberal, libertarian streak in this that's very strong, and that individuals should be free to get the rewards or suffer the damage of failing to be successful. If it's a free market and everybody gets to express their capacities, then the benefits should, of course, accrue to those who are deserving, and those who don't get benefits are, of course, those who don't deserve them. Low taxes, back with free market and deregulation. You lower the burden on individuals and business. This allows them more latitude to do what they want. You shrink government, which only interferes in things and doesn't help out. And so the lower the taxes, the better. You need independent central banks because for fiscal responsibility, which we'll see in a second, that governments interfere with the operation of good financial systems and with banking and with capital distribution and with fiscal policy because they have interests that are not, do not work within this model. And so what you want is independent central banks that can make sure that your fiscal policy is handled by the professionals who know what's going on without the interference of those, pesky elected officials. And then government should pursue a program of fiscal responsibility, low deficits, good trade balances, sustainable spending, these sorts of things. And, if you think about like projects of the World Bank that's intervened in infinite number of small and medium-sized economies over the last 30 years, basically this is what they've been pushing for. Now, some of this is just prima facie ridiculous. I mean, there's all kinds of criticisms of this, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But of note for our purposes, or at least my purposes in this lecture, and to understand how this relates to populism, is notice there's a couple of, even in these underlying assumptions, some deeper underlying assumptions. One, that free markets are good at distributing goods and services, and that governments are bad at it. And the problem with this, which is of course obvious if anybody ponders, is their incentives are not to distribute goods and services, but to make profits. And so sometimes that lines up, and then that helps goods and services be distributed, and sometimes it doesn't. And so, for instance, it may be really good for everyone to have, say, socialized health care, but it's not profitable for companies to have that. And so companies constantly fight governments to try and get rid of socialized health care because they can profit more off sick people. Now, this isn't good for sick people, for people to profit off of them, but it is good for individual companies. So a free market there is one that's classically pointed out as being troublesome. Also notions like deregulation. So what's bizarre to me, and this is one of my favorite ones, is so like the banking, as will be very important for the 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11 financial collapse, was the deregulation of banks. This was a multi-decade push to get banks deregulated, and this makes no sense. So even the name is completely misleading here because a bank is itself a collection of regulations. It's a legal entity. It is, by definition, regulation. If you have no regulation, you have no banks. And by the way, this has existed in the past because there were people who had large reserves of whatever your cash of the moment was. Could be gold, could be silver, could be assignats, could be, wheat, whatever it is. And they would loan capital of various forms and invest in various forms. And they generally just had agreements with big guys with sharp things. And, they would collect. If you couldn't pay, they would, kill you and collect or whatever, So this was the function of banking has been around without sort of regulation. But what it just means is sort of thuggery, right? But any modern sense of what banks do requires regulation. They are, I don't know how else to put it. It's just so it's like an ocean without water. Like, okay, let's have a waterless ocean. You're like, nah. Yeah, it's sort of core to the concept of ocean that they have water. And if you have a waterless ocean, you've got something very different. An unregulated bank is not a thing because otherwise they can't operate. They can't function without regulation. They're protected legal entities. They have access to the courts. They have property rights. They have, this goes infinite amount of regulation that makes banks work. And if you don't have that regulation, banks don't function. So this notion of deregulation itself is nonsensical. What they really mean is the regulation we want. So get rid of the regulations we don't want and get the regulations we want. And when you think about it this way, I think what you'll see, it helps clarify it because the question is, what is the regulation doing? Well, it's trying to produce outcomes. The banks want the outcomes that are most profitable for the banks. Governments tend, in theory, to want the outcome that is either best for, say, government tax revenue or to protect the people in general or lots of other possible outcomes. But the banks have a very specific, they want to be able to grow, they want to be able to make more money, they don't want the government taking tax from them. And so when they say deregulation, they don't mean deregulation, they mean change the regulation so that we get the maximum benefit, we being the banks and the shareholders of the banks, and nobody else does. They're not interested in other people getting benefits. So when you hear the term deregulation, always think that what this really is an argument about how and where and when and under what circumstances the various benefits, responsibilities, and productivity trade-offs are sorted. It's not about deregulation because, again, you can't have a deregulated bank. It's not a thing. And then when you talk about free movement, lots of people have talked about the globalization. Let's have the free movement of goods and capital. Notice not people, right? Like this is, what's interesting is if you go back and look at the history of this, the notion that people should be able to move freely, to make markets move efficiently, is in the historical record. I mean, this was a clear concept, but it's a very politically unpalatable concept in many parts of the world. And so the neoliberal, like deregulation, globalization, didn't mean deregulate the movement of people. They're very much in favor of regulating the movement of people. Or, if you think about all the controversy about the American border, what's going on in Europe today, this is true all over the world, right? That Japan is struggling with this. Goods and services, okay. Capital, okay. People, ooh. So let's not get too much deregulation, right? Not too much globalization. So this also highlights the degree to which this is not an argument about regulation or not regulation or freedom of movement or not freedom of movement. It's an argument about the distribution of benefits and costs and how best to do that. By the way, which is completely a legitimate debate. This doesn't mean this is illegitimate. It just means that's what's really being discussed rather than some, abstract system that will make everything good for everybody. And finally, I'll skip through some of the other ones and go to the fiscal responsibility, which is low deficits and moderate trade balances and light tax burdens, and all of this that goes along with the concept of the neoliberal order, and that people and governments were forced by central bank interventions or by monetary fund intervention, by threats from the bond market, right, constantly threatening people's currencies, countries' currencies. These sorts of things were supposed to put discipline and responsibility onto governments to keep them from doing daft things and from going bankrupt or creating hyperinflation or making bad things happen, which is not bad. Hyperinflation, bad, right? So it's not in itself a terrible idea. However, once again, it points out that the problem that's going to happen and the threat to the smooth running of the global economy and making everybody rich and improving the lives of everyone is governments. These are the threats. If you mitigate and limit the capacity of governments to create all this trouble, then what you have is the best possible system. So, underwriting all of this, by the way, is the notion that if you get the money right and the money flows right and the deficits right and the taxes right and the finance capital right, everything else is great. You get that right, everything follows. Don't have to worry about the rest of it because by some unforeseen law of the universe, what happens is the world will be a great place because global finance capital and global governments have got their shit together. The machine is running smoothly. Hey presto, we have no problems. Okay. Of course, we know what happens is this entire system blows up. It blows up in 2007, 8, 9, 10. There's about a 3-year period there where the entire global financial system really goes off the rails. We talk about Lehman Brothers United States, talk about the Greek debt crisis in Europe. It's a hugely interesting, very detailed and fascinating experience that most of us lived through. But what impact of it was to fundamentally challenge all of these assumptions, because the key or a key aspect of this was not a government failure. This was a failure of the system that had been freed up. This was a failure of the banking and international finance system And it needed the governments to come in, particularly the United States government and the Federal Reserve, to intervene and save it. So all of these notions, all of these concepts proved functionally to be absolutely unsustainable. They just failed. So the free market broke down. And like we talk about deregulation, I talked about the notion that no, it doesn't mean deregulation, it means the regulation they want. And one of the great things about the banking collapse, if there's anything great about a banking collapse, was that the banks had recently, I think, I should get a date on that, when Basel II passed, 2004, right around in there, sorry, I should have looked that up, was a new set of banking regulations, which of course let banks do more crazy shit that led to them blowing up. And that new global compact on banking was written by the banks. Quite literally, the banks wrote the document they signed on deregulation. So they got the regulation that they wanted, and what they immediately did is use that to blow the system up. And so this crazy event takes place where you have governments, and again, particularly the US government, having to intervene on a massive level. Now, this is where it gets almost unbelievable. The amount of money and liquidity, this is, of course, it was a liquidity crisis where the banks didn't have anywhere near the amount of capital they needed relative to the amount of risk that they had out there. And particularly, they had a lot of short-term exposure, so things, they needed a lot of money every day or every other day or every week or every month to make the system run, but their assets were valuable only on a long-term basis. And so if those assets dropped, everybody would need money all at once, and of course, this is what happens. So where does all that money come from? So over the course of about 3 or 4 years during the crisis, this phenomenal thing happened where the Central Bank of the United States and the US government, and in cooperation with European governments and European central banks, and the UK, of course, included in here, and some of the other, major Asian players, pumped so much. I mean, it's trillions and trillions of dollars. One way to think of it, maybe it's a sort of apples to oranges comparison, but people talk about, the U.S. government debt. It's, whatever, 28 trillion or 30 trillion dollars is this huge, unsustainable, completely unpayable. There's no way we'll ever meet that. Our children are going to be burdened with this. By the way, this is neoliberal concept. This is all neoliberalism, right? This notion that these debts are unpayable and they're going to destroy the future and our children are going to starve because of this. There's no evidence this is true, by the way. It's just that this is the value concept, right? It's good to have a balanced budget because of some reason, because it's moral, right? It's sort of ethically better to have a balanced budget. But what happens here is as much liquidity as would be needed basically to pay off the U.S. national debt was pumped into the global financial system. Trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in all kinds of different ways. Direct loans to foreign central banks, direct loans to government, buying assets that had no value so that they would maintain their value and using them as collateral so banks and other institutions could recollateralize themselves, right? There's just enormous, massive intervention on a just historically completely unprecedented scale. I mean, nothing like this had ever happened. It's not clear much of this was really legal. Lots of it was done in total secrecy, because people were going to freak out if they find out that we're pushing a few $1 trillion of liquidity into European central banks. Meanwhile, by the way, the European central banks were criticizing the U.S. because they were, because we're so irresponsible, because they got to play like they were good because they were secretly taking all this money that was keeping them from blowing up, until you got the Greek financial crisis. But I digress. So what happens here is all of the major assumptions, like individual responsibility, except for we all saw that the individuals who are running these banks didn't get fired, didn't go to jail, didn't get arrested, didn't lose they got raises and they got bonuses. And this is one of the huge, everybody was furious because where's individual responsibility? You took an institution bankrupted, had to have the government bail you out, and you get a bonus? There's no individual responsibility there. What is it? How does low taxes work in an environment where the governments all over the world are just giving money away like willy-nilly to try and keep all these institutions floating. Where's the fiscal responsibility of these banking institutions? So what's interesting is at the same time that governments are being told to be fiscally responsible, international finance capitalists, banking, investment firms were being wildly fiscally irresponsible. So apparently it's okay for them to be fiscally responsible, but governments know now they have to be fiscally responsible. And so every part of this was thrown into question. Clearly it wasn't operating as a free market. That's just totally silly, right? Because when you have to have governments intervene at this level, you're just not a free market anymore. Obviously, the quote-unquote deregulation looked a little bit suspicious when everybody found out what was going on. The individual responsibility, as I mentioned, taxes, that doesn't make any sense. And so you end up in this place where you go, oh, even central bank independence, because the Fed was basically on its own, very independently, launching massive programs without trying to let anybody know what they were doing. It's like, oh, hey, now people sort of started thinking, that might not be a good idea. Maybe we do need to oversee some of this. Now, it should be noted, interestingly, that much of this was paid back. And even, some governments may have even made a bit of a profit on some of this. However, this is very different from it being a good idea or from it being, representative that, oh, this all worked out for the best. No, clearly this was a complete failure of the system, and governments were able to prop these businesses up with loans that they were eventually able to pay because they were propped up, right? So it was sort of circular. But still, this massive intervention created some questions, and that's where we are today. So people on the left and the right became very frustrated because ultra-right, super free marketers said, just let the system burn, right? That's what a free market should do. A free market is a system that if it fails, you just let it fail. There's a lot of reasons to think that would be a bad idea because what that would have meant is governments just nationalizing banks, which they de facto did anyway. But the banks would have just had to be nationalized, the government takes them over, and most of these real free market people don't really want governments just running all the banks. So it was kind of an incoherent response, but it really frustrated them, and they're still frustrated today, by the way. And on the left, you had this very also reasonable critique, which is to say, hey, you bailed out all the banks, they got their bonuses. These big financial institutions not only didn't go away, they got bigger. Not only did the wealthy not do well, they did great because the kind of assets the wealthy hold did spectacularly well through this, and they were able to get much better rates and so on and so forth. And so, both the hard right and the pretty serious left came out of this frustrated and angry at what they thought is a system that was rigged. It did not operate the way everyone had been told it was operating. The neoliberal conception turned out to be non-functional. Now, what this means is our fundamental values, our fundamental worldview has been challenged. And this puts us into a place of interregnum, a place where we don't know what to do. And you see this everywhere today. If you're trying to think about governments are responding to different kinds of financial crises and budget deficits, and it's pretty clear that they're just torn because they don't have a coherent policy that they can pursue that makes sense to enough people anymore to make it usable as an argument. For 30 years, if you argued we need to have low taxes, we need to balance the budget, and we need to keep our deficits in balance, and we need to deregulate banks, whether or not it was a good idea didn't matter. People will go, oh, okay, that seems reasonable. Sure, let's do that. Like, no one's going to be in the street. Those days are past. And so we're at this interesting moment in history where it's like, oh, our old value system has really come under question. We really don't have a new one. And historically speaking, and this is where I'm going to sound a little conservative, because I think fundamentally in some ways I am in this sense, that history is pretty clear that when you lose one value system, it's a rough struggle to get a new one, and it's not necessarily the case that the new one is always better. Right? I think there's this notion of the revolution, the revolution is the opiate of the intellectual. The idea of like, oh, we're just going to burn everything down, we're going to overthrow everything, and then from the rubble, we're going to build the shining city on the hill. This is going to be this spectacular, quick, fast, like reconstruction of this ideal utopia. And all we need to do is just burn everything we have down. Historically, when you burn everything down, what you get is ashes, right? Like this is that probably intervening to save all the banks was a good idea because no one really knew what would happen if the entire global financial system collapsed. But the suspicion is it wouldn't be fun. What happened wasn't that much fun either, right? So this is the problem. Like people go, well, this was terrible. And it's like, yeah, could have been handled better, yes. Should we have done other things in retrospect? Probably. But wow, like we can't really be sure that burning down the current system is going to create something better. And so it's like, ooh, maybe evolve? By step, can we do this? Can we do slow transition, reevaluation, etc.? But that's always tricky because we love this notion that we're just going to rip the bandage off. We're going to go in there and do something really aggressive, and there's going to be pain, but it'll be short. And then the next day, we're all going to wake up, and it'll just be beautiful. The sun will be shining, and we'll have no problems anymore. The historical record suggests that is unlikely to happen. And so here's where we were, by the way. We were in this place where we were already suspicious of all of these, free market neoliberal concepts. Lots of people angry. Populism already on the rise because they had seen that there was a certain lie here, because it was a lie that all these, my government, if I'm a small Eastern European country, we're supposed to do all these things to be to get in order and tie ourselves in the global economy, and we're supposed to cut our deficits and not help the people, and then all of a sudden the international crisis happens and our economy just gets gutted, right? Like we lose 30% of our GDP or something like that, like a crazy abuse. And so not only did we cut our services, now we have to cut them more. And for what? What did we get out of it? We got a, kick in the stomach. That's basically what a lot of countries got out of it. And this makes you pause and go, hey. And so just in case we were wondering about this, then came the COVID crisis. And it turns out that governments can just shut down the global economy and send everybody money willy-nilly. Like, wow. And so I think this is a final sense of dissonance in all this. Like, it's such a major blow to say, oh, what happened to free market? What happened to free flow of goods? What happened to individual responsibility? What happened to, fiscal responsibility? Oh, you know what? Forget all that. Like, shut it down, close everybody up, businesses are closed, nobody go out. Right? I'm not saying this is wrong, by the way. I'm just saying it exposes the degree to which all this free market deregulation talk was always nonsense. And it's always been nonsense, by the way, because there is not a government and an economy. There isn't like fiscal markets and governments. In most countries, the government is the single biggest financial player. They spend the most money, they get the taxes, they employ a lot of people. Their defense budgets are huge parts of most countries' industry and an industrial base. Generally the largest single employer will be the government, local and state and national, right? All of it. I mean, they're huge, massive. They're the biggest player in the economies of a country, and then to pretend like they're not part of the economy is sort of, bizarre. You're sort of, Alice in Wonderland territory here. But this is what we were doing. This is part of the neoliberal dream, is to pretend like that is the case, even though, obviously factually it's not. And so then the COVID crisis happens. And so any sort of shreds of sort of efficacy or belief of the technocrats trying to hang on to the last vestiges of this sort of, blows up because none of this makes sense, right? Clearly, when push comes to shove, we don't care about the neoliberal order. Also, war, by the way, when war comes and the big fight happens, Ukraine, Israel today, right? Forget all this stuff, like all the neoliberal points, we just forget about them, right? And so, yeah, turns out, really raises the questions about this. And the problem is, and again, this is back to the values thing, is we don't have coherent new values yet. And again, it's not to say that all the ideas of neoliberalism are terrible and wrong. It's just to say that value set got seriously questioned, sort of like the Reformation, when the Catholic Church had to look around one morning and go, oh my gosh, there's millions and millions of non-Catholic Christians. This is really confusing. Like, this fundamentally changes the way you conceptualize Catholicism when there's another bunch of religious people who are quote unquote Christians, but just not Catholic. I mean, this messes up the whole program. And so when you recognize this and you realize that one of the things that's going on, lots of things going on in the world, of course, but one of the things that's driving populism is this desperation for something to replace that set of values that had sort of loosely organized not just the United States, not just the UK, but pretty much a good chunk of the global international trade and financial system, treaties, negotiations, the language, the conceptual framework of this neoliberal concepts were just sort of taken for granted. Like, you didn't have to argue that these were a good things. You didn't have to make the case. Now, of course, you're always arguing, should it be this free? Should we have these tariffs? You're always arguing about that. But everyone sort of agreed that the best case would be if we could just get rid of all of the inner blocks of trade. But we know that's not really possible, so we'll just work towards it slowly. Well, now no one believes that at all, right? We all recognize that whole concept blew up and is out the window. But no one has articulated clearly what is the next concept or set of values that we're supposed to adopt. And so we're in this bizarre space again where we don't really know exactly what to believe and how to respond. You can see this in England, the UK, because they Brexited. Nice job, guys. They've created a whole bunch of problems for their economy, but they also need to balance their deficit. But they also need, because of the international bond market is getting dubious on their capacity to pay, these sorts of issues. And so they're facing high inflation, energy, but they're facing a whole bunch of problems. And it's clear that there is nothing in the neoliberal order that is going to help them. Cutting taxes won't help because they desperately need to invest because they're starved for internal investment. Having individual responsibility won't help because what are individuals supposed to do when they've sort of done these global treaty problems? Global free movement of good and capitals, well, Brexit sort of sank that concept. And so, how? And then the left over there also is struggling. Like, it looks like probably a Labour government on the way before too long. But they don't know what to do either because they're like, oh, we would really love to announce that we're going to invest $500 million into the country, but they can't bring themselves to question these fundamental principles of fiscal responsibility, central bank independence, low taxes that would be necessary to kind of start going, hey, how do we really begin to rethink this, right? How do we really begin to come up with a new approach? And so so you can just, when you listen to them talk or read their statements, you're like, oh, you're just doomed because you're struggling here. You're just torn because you don't have a clear vision that you can articulate that addresses the sort of blind spots and misunderstandings that grow from this kind of concept that all these leaders grew up with, because this is the generation of leaders. The reason you get to be where you are today is because you were growing up with and becoming politically successful during the neoliberal world order dominance, and then you have to suffer through a decade of collapse, more than a decade now, but you still don't have a new mindset. I mean, somebody will. Some new ideas will come up, new ways of thinking about this, but we're not there yet. And at the core, and this for me, all of that I think is hopefully not terribly controversial. I just think is an expression of where the values that we've had, when they get questioned, when they get brought to light, it turns out they're often very incoherent, as neoliberal values are. B, we don't like it. It makes us uncomfortable. We like to have those things assumed because it allows us to operate without tension and friction. And 3, we really don't want to move on from our old values until we have some new ones. But what do you do in that intermediate space? Well, you get populism, I would say, is one thing you get. You get this sort of noisy, painful, uncomfortable political, geopolitical, financial environments that we're experiencing now. And the history of this is very clear. But underwriting a lot of this, and to go back where we began, that these are values questions, is I would argue that one of the things that happened in the second half of the 20th century is, we have decline of religion, old value systems have gone away. Something that one thinker, his name escapes me, he called it heroic materialism or heroic consumerism. I've mentioned this before. And we replaced a whole bunch of other values with money. Like money was the answer. And undergirding everything, as I mentioned, the neoliberal order was like, if you get the money right, if you get the economics of growth and cash and income right, everything else will follow, right? That is the key. That's the number one thing. Once that's right, all good things flow from there. And if that's wrong, then nothing valuable can happen. So let's focus on this. Other stuff needs to happen. It's not, totally unitary, but that's happening. And this was a consensus left and right. This was not a conservative notion. This was a consensus on both sides. They argued about what the best way to do it was, but they didn't argue about that fundamental principle. And I think what is happening, and what has happened and is happening, is that money has been desacralized. Money is no longer sacred. It's in a new environment, intellectually, emotionally, and values, where people are going, it may not be about the money, right? There's a lot of other things that can take place and happen that aren't about this, and that we need to stop thinking about the money first and put other values to the fore. Now, we haven't decided to do this yet, but when that real core sense of hey, the government just spent, tens of trillions of dollars bailing out banks, where'd that money come from? Why isn't that money available for other things? Hey, they just made look, COVID panic, they just sent everybody checks in the mail. They just sent wait a second, this money stuff is starting to look kind of funny. And then you see increasingly people are like, hey, if I have a job and I make a lot of money, but I feel wildly insecure, I don't feel that good about the money. If I had money in the bank and the banks are getting shaky, well, I don't feel that good about the money. If supposedly everything was going well and all of a sudden all the banks blew up because of the way they're handling money, I don't feel that good about the money. And so what you end up with is not so much a struggle with particular regulation or particular ideas, but how do you replace the concept of cash as God, essentially, right? That, if you get a good job and make a lot of money, you'll be fine. Well, everybody, I think, is aware now that this is not true. Google is struggling with this because they made a bunch of money, they have all the money, and they're just firing people kind of randomly, and it's making everybody at Google miserable. So here's the people who did everything right. They worked hard, they did well in school, they got hired by one of the top companies in the world. That company is super profitable, super profitable, billions and billions a quarter. And yet they feel insecure and unhappy, even though they're incredibly highly compensated and well respected. Right? At that point, if even the people who are quote unquote winning begin to think that this is winning looks a whole lot like losing, then increasing amounts of people start asking hey, wait a second, what's going on? And again, this makes everybody nervous and unhappy. But if you're going to reform or reevaluate your values, it's almost a necessary element. And so as you ponder, if you see the news or talk to people, think about this. Keep it in your mind. We've been through this 17-year sort of crazy challenge to what had been a really core set of principles. And that now that those principles are being undercut, been shown to be faulty, have, self-contradictory, all the things that we talked about, it makes people nervous and unhappy and uncomfortable. And so when you see people going, make America great again, just to pick on the Trump people, like, no, that's right. Like, they're in some ways they're correct. But I think one of the things they're articulating is make it the world so that it's simple and coherent again. This is a reasonable thing, right? Like, I mean, the world is going to be the world, but it is not, I think, crazy to want the world to be coherent and not to like want to be able to have a value system that makes me make sense of it. That's people really like that. Probably unfortunately, but they really do. They really want to have a simple, articulable set of values that they can just go with and be happy and everything, and know everything is going to be good. And so, yeah, people go, oh, just make it great again. Make it the way it was. Make it so that I understood it. Make it so it's comfortable for me. Make it so I feel good about myself. And those kinds of, when that gets taken away, well, you see what we have all over the world is people going, hey, wait, we need something different. We need something new. We need a set of new values. And so when you see the appeal to like really strong nationalism, when you see appeals to sort of quote unquote traditional or family or Christian or these sorts of concepts, it is this attempt to replace a failing value system. Now, is this a good idea? No, I don't think necessarily so, but it is an understandable response. And when you look at the neoliberal order, it's not that everything about it is a terrible idea, but it does, when it becomes gospel, when it becomes this necessary set of beliefs that everyone is supposed to live by, and then it blows up, boy, that's troubling. And unfortunately, we find ourselves living to a very large degree in those troubles. And as a final note, and this comes from Barzan, you look at this and you go but to go back, a lot of good was achieved with the neoliberal order. If you look at the amount of people lifted out of poverty during that period, if you look at the growth of the global economy, if you look at the increase in education, if you look at increase in lifespan, if you look at like just basically any measure you can come up with, lots and lots of great things were achieved. And again, the temptation is to go, oh, that system failed. These things are terrible. Industry or global finance has shown itself to be completely irresponsible. It needs to be eliminated, right? These kinds of knee-jerk reactions that you hear on, again, both left and right. This comes from every side. Is sort of a threat. Like it's a threat to say, oh, wait. And Barzan says the question to always ask is, hey, if we're going to change, what's worth maintaining? And what needs to be gotten rid of, and what needs to be made new. Right? We need to ask all three of those questions, because if we just say burn it down and make new, we're going to lose a lot, probably a whole lot, that was incredibly valuable. And when we go to make it new, it's probably better to say, hey, let's make new things that augment and build on and grow and keep what's best about this, and not lose what's bad. What was good. And when you look about like say, hey, how can we get rid of or mitigate or reduce the negative impacts, the part that really did influence us in an unhealthy way, is to be clear on why that is and say, okay, this is going to be an intervention. We're going to have to change this, and here's why, and to know why. Because again, the notion of going someone's sick, let's do some random surgery and hope for the best, right? That sort of medieval approach to medicine is kind of a tricky history. So I was sort of again inspired to this because of the populism lecture, and that you see both from left and right these sort of crazy critiques of our global financial and capitalist and socialist systems and how they all interlink. And it's like, yeah, on one hand, I get it. People are frustrated and angry, and populism is populism, right? Now, on the other hand, as a values question, this is a very human, very understandable, and historically very well documented process that societies and systems go through. But as someone who thinks about this and studies it and looks at the historical processes, successful revolutions that deliver really good things for pretty much most of the people are really rare. Usually, evolutionary policies that try to really deal with the negatives while maintaining the good stuff, those are the ones that tend to deliver the most benefits. And so it is an interesting time to be alive. But as you go about, again, talk to people, listen to news, read articles, see if you can hear this resonance of, We don't know what the value should be, the insecurity that they're articulating probably unconsciously, and particularly look for the desacralization of money, because that's one I'm just really becoming increasingly interested in. So thank you very much, sort of Populism Part 2. Hope you enjoyed it.